it always. I'm gonna share my screen. All right, about 30 more seconds to pop on in the Zoom if you haven't already. Get yourself comfortable, get your lunch together. We are going to be talking about communication partner instruction. This is the last of our webinar series this month for the month of October. So thank you if you've joined us for the previous ones. Thank you. If you missed some, we will be recording them. They've all been recorded and they'll be posted on our website for your future perusal at your leisure. My name is Cassie. I'm one of the speech language pathologists and AAC services coordinators here on staff at TechOWL. We're housed within the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University. And today we're going to be talking about communication partner instruction, specifically for adults who use AAC who have intellectual or developmental disabilities. Let's jump into it. So by the end of this session, I'm hoping that you're able to talk about some barriers that exist for communication partners when supporting AAC users. I hope that you can identify 2 strategies for empowering teams to support AAC users in home and community settings. And I'll also hope that you can identify 3 resources that are available to you and to teams to support communication partners in learning about AAC. Some disclaimers, the ones on the slide, and then some additional disclaimers we'll review as well. So I'm speaking from the perspective of a speech language pathologist. I work with adults with complex communication needs and intellectual and developmental disabilities across the state of Pennsylvania. So I am speaking from a very limited lens. I encourage everybody to speak with and access perspectives of AAC users for this content and everything AAC. You know, it's important that we center the voices of AAC users as part of our discussions. I will use a variety of identity first and person first language to accommodate both preferences. So I might say AAC user, or I might say person who uses AAC. 2 additional disclaimers. I am a fast talker, so please feel free to tell me to slow down. Someone will let me know. And I also have a very cute but sometimes loud dog. So if you hear him, he's sending his love. So some acronyms for the presentation today: augmentative and alternative communication. You know it, you love it. When I speak about AAC today, I will be referring to both low-tech communication, high-tech communication, and no-tech AAC. So if somebody is using a communication board or a PEX book, somebody might be using a high-tech device, or they might be using verbalization, their body language. All of that kind of falls within AAC and falls within the AAC users we'll discuss today. ALS, aided language stimulation. CP is the most frequent acronym you'll see throughout this presentation, which stands for communication partner. When I reference CP, we're talking about residential staff, we're talking about direct support professionals, we're talking about the teams and the individuals that are supporting our adults with ID, DD, intellectual or developmental disability. So let's start by talking about a little bit of some societal changes with the disability model and lens. So we know that there's been a lot of changes with legislation and policy that have really centralized the experiences of adults with disabilities to be integrated within the community. We know that adults with intellectual disability and developmental disability are participating more in the community than ever before. They're living in the community, they're working in the community, they have social relationships, they attend gatherings, they have vocational goals. So the expectations of the team is that we're facilitating the participation of these adults with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities in participating in community in the way that feels congruent for them and that feels meaningful for them. That being said, with these greater expectations for participation, we also see a greater demand for access to AAC. So folks might use some form of communication at home, but when they go to transition into a vocational setting, sometimes that communication modality maybe isn't going to be necessarily useful for them in that setting, so they might need to learn or access AAC in some other capacity. So we're noticing that the expectations are greater, not only for our intellectual disability folks, but also the teams that support them to integrate them into the community and use AAC while they do so. So this might be kind of super basic, but I really want to drive home the point before we jump into it that communication is a two-way street and it goes both ways. So in order for communication to be successful, it has to be transactional. Both parties have to be able to send and receive messages. And we find that there can be a big mismatch in individuals using AAC and their communication partners in this capacity. Communication partners' interaction style impacts AAC users and impacts the ability and the likelihood that somebody is going to use AAC. If a communication partner is interrupting somebody frequently, dominating the conversation, asking close-ended questions, they're not really being facilitative for folks to use AAC who might need a little bit more time to form their message. And this quote is super helpful for driving this point home that support staff who are educated on care, who are educated in taking care of our adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, don't feel as involved in supporting their communication needs because they view care as their primary responsibility. So how can we as a team consider the impact of AAC on the staff that are working with our adults with intellectual disability and facilitate their understanding and knowledge to support communication? So they have to be part of the conversation to help support folks in using AAC. So there's been two main groups of team members identified as communication partners for our adults with ID or DD. The first group of people is that education or care relationships, your direct support professionals, healthcare professionals, residential staff, and then the folks who have social relationships with AAC users like friends, siblings, or parents. We have to acknowledge that we ask, especially group one, the educational or care relationships, we ask a lot of these people. They wear a lot of hats. They have many responsibilities. They have a lot of folks that they take care of. They have a lot of tasks that they need to do. So we have to acknowledge that AAC implementation is an additional responsibility and additional expectation on these folks who are already working very hard to support individuals with intellectual or developmental disability out in the community. So Joanne Danker and her colleagues did a systemic review of 14 articles about adults with intellectual or developmental disability out in the community to identify the most common AAC systems that they're using. First up was PECS. Second most common was an iPad with a communication app, and then third most common was manual signs. It's unclear to me whether PECS refers to the specific PECS protocol or whether it refers to the use of like a low-tech communication binder to facilitate choice making or requesting. There is a difference, you know, if you want to call something PECS, you have to be PECS trained, but a lot of people use this term as kind of a catch-all for like a low-tech communication binder. And then the most common communication functions that were targeted is choice making and requesting. This makes a lot of sense to me as I think about teams out in the community and working with individuals in the home, identifying these kind of more basic communication functions to help support using AAC, easy to teach and help people to learn. So one size doesn't fit all. We know that all of us are multimodal communicators. Some people might use a high-tech system, but also find support in low-tech devices as well as nonverbal signals like body language or gestures. It's important that we kind of help educate folks that all communication is valid and accepted. High-tech systems are, of course, going to need more support from staff, more buy-in from teams to implement, but give access to more language than maybe a low-tech device does. It's important to consider the context of the situation, the communication partner, and the communication demands of the situation when we're thinking about how that individual is going to communicate. So let's jump into a little bit of the research on communication partner instruction. We're going to get into the weeds a little bit, but I promise we will come out the other side of it. So Adina Haley and her colleagues reviewed the literature on the experiences of communication partners communicating with adults with intellectual or developmental disability. And she identified 4 barriers that were present for these teams. Every barrier is going to have a little bit different piece of the pie, right? For some teams, maybe a time barrier is bigger than access barriers, but these are the general themes of barriers that she identified. So the first barrier is time. We know that communication partners, DSPs, residential staff have a high workload. This high demand for providing physical care often can lead to missed opportunities for communication interactions. We might miss communication signals or opportunities for connection because staff are so focused on providing physical care to somebody. Access barriers are another huge barrier. Access to not only the professionals to teach the AAC device or equipment, but also access to the equipment itself. Adina surveyed a bunch of staff, 138, and she identified that 75% of staff indicated that AAC equipment was not always available to them when working with an adult with intellectual or developmental disabilities. 75% of staff don't feel like they have access to the equipment that they need. That's not going to help facilitate anybody to use or learn AAC, right? And then this last point under access barriers, access to training, 40% of staff it says could describe, it should say could not describe the current form. Or wait, no, it is could. I don't know. Wait, 40% of staff could. Yeah, okay, only 40%. Wow, I'm mixing up my own numbers. Only 40% of staff could identify the current form of communication of adults with ID or DD that they work with. Only 40% understood how that person communicated. That's unbelievable. We have to be teaching folks who work with these individuals what they use to communicate. They need to be part of that conversation. The last 2 barriers, communication style barriers and attitude. So we know that communication style is a big factor in helping our individuals who use AAC be supported in using AAC. So a lot of communication partners might use dominating communication styles like asking close-ended questions, providing limited opportunities for AAC users to start conversations, or frequently interrupting them. Hanley and her colleagues identified that less than 50% of staff believed that changing their own communication style would impact the AAC user. Again, just a mismatch in understanding. Communication style of a communication partner is essential. Remember, communication goes both ways. So if people are not believing or thinking that their own communication is going to impact somebody else, there's some education that needs to be done there. And then attitude barriers, probably the largest barrier identified in the research is the low expectations that staff might have about an individual's ability or performance. One survey found that 25% of staff expected adults with intellectual disabilities to communicate. Only 25% of staff felt that their individuals with intellectual disabilities had the capability to communicate. It breaks my heart because it's not true at all, but it's an attitude that staff might be approaching situations with, so it's something to be aware of, and it's some education and training that can be done to change these attitude barriers. So Adina Hanley and her colleagues did a meta-analysis. They looked at 8 studies and they looked at communication partners' experiences communicating with adults with ID or DD using AAC. Very niche, very specific. We're really in the weeds. I told you we'd get there. She identified 4 themes of communication partners' experiences. The first theme is knowledge of AAC. She found that training specifically for manual signs was more successful when done by SLPs or official training programs. They found that DSPs, direct support professionals, were able to produce more manual signs when that training was provided by an SLP than when the training was done by a support person. Low level of knowledge of AAC is considered like a barrier for AAC users to utilize their equipment. If somebody doesn't understand how to use the device, you're not going to use it with them. That's, game, set, match, right? And then attitudes. Again, we talked about attitudes, but the interesting thing that Hanley found in her article, in her research, was that the level of knowledge that somebody has on a personal level about a adult with intellectual disability can be both a hindrance and a facilitator for using AAC. Think about it. If you've worked with Tommy for 10 years as his DSP, you might feel like you understand what Tommy is saying. You don't need AAC. You can interpret his intended message. You can make assumptions about what he's trying to say. Whether you're right or wrong, nobody's the wiser, right? Necessarily. So that can be a barrier. They're reluctant to use AAC because the idea is, well, I already know Tommy really well. But on the other hand, knowing Tommy really well might also help them buy in that this is a tool that could really help Tommy in the future. Maybe an iPad with an app could really help him. So it kind of goes both ways. It's not one directional. As we discussed earlier, one of the largest barriers for AAC implementation is the attitudes and buy-in from staff. So we need to make sure that there's the shared commitment for communication partners. One of the biggest mismatches is the uncertain ownership, unclear roles and responsibilities on the team. Whose job is it to get the device off the charger every day and set it up at the breakfast table? Like, whose role is it? I don't know. If it's not my job, I'm not going to do it, right? And I think that we have to make sure we're helping teams find those roles and responsibilities to be successful in implementing AAC. And then the suitability of AAC. We talk a lot about feature matching in the AAC world and matching the equipment, the language system to the individual. But I'd also encourage you to consider the team's comfort levels, the team's perception of the equipment as an important factor in deciding whether the AAC system that we're using is suitable and going to be functional for the setting that the individual lives in. If somebody has a device that transitioned with them from school and the vocabulary isn't relevant, then the team isn't going to feel like that's a suitable AAC system. He's not in art class anymore. We don't need art vocabulary, so this isn't working for him. So that's just something to consider as well, thinking about the team in that regard. So Jennifer Kent Walsh and David McNaughton had this landmark article in 2005 where they identified the lack of training for communication partners. They were like, hey, this is a big problem. We need to train communication partners better. They're crucial to helping people be successful using their AAC. And so they created this 8-step model for communication partner instruction. And we will not be going through these steps because my question to you, as folks who work in this field, is it realistic to go through 8 steps to teach skills to our communication partners who we just talked about have limited access to AAC professionals, limited time, high workload? The answer is probably not. If it is for your team, shoot me an email. We can talk about these steps in detail. We can go through them. I'd love to talk about it. But this standard probably serves more as the gold standard. It's probably not realistic for the reality of like the everyday adult world. So let's break it down. We've talked about the research. Where do we go from here? So Kent Walsh and McNaughton in that same article identified 4 skill areas that were important to teach communication partners. So they talked about the how to teach communication partners, but this is the what. This is the content that communication partners need to know. So we're going to walk through some of these things. The first thing to teach communication partners, DSPs, residential staff, people who are working with our adults with intellectual disability is operational skills. If folks do not know how to turn on the equipment, how to look at the device, how to add buttons, how to program words, they will not use it. This is the first baseline entry thing that we need to teach folks is operational skills. How can we do that? Well, you can come to Just So Speech Services and do video trainings with myself and my colleague Jen, who's here. We'll talk about that later. There are YouTube or online resources. You can attend a training with your local device representative. If somebody is using a low-tech system, making sure that we're teaching people how to create more icons and how to laminate them, if that's part of the discussion, these operational skills come first. So once we know how to operate the equipment, we have to know how to set it up and position it. So this is especially important for folks who use alternative access. If somebody is using a switch or a mount or eye gaze, we need to know and teams need to be taught how to set that up so that the individual is successful and able to use that equipment properly. Same thing goes for our low-tech folks. If you have a binder of photos and icons, how is that binder organized? Can we make sure that, if there's icons that need to go on the front of the binder versus inside the binder, does everybody understand how to set that up for the individual? So what are some strategies that we can use to teach communication partners these skills? Well, if somebody has a mounting system, eye gaze, head tracking, a complicated access method, I highly recommend contacting device vendors or the prescribing speech language pathologist for demonstration, hands-on assistance. And then I'd recommend recording that for future reference so that the team can go back and reference that. Providing written instructions is another great way to help people walk through positioning or setup. I often encourage people to put like little sticky notes or little visual cues on the device itself, like, oh, the mount needs to go at this angle. There's a cue right here on a little sticky note, or there's written instructions on the wall so that folks have something to reference in real time when they're trying to set up their AAC device. So once we know positioning, we know operational skills, how do we interact with it? How do we use it? So we need to teach communication partner skills. Communication partners, some of those skills that facilitate AAC users and help AAC users to be a part of the conversation and not using those dominating communication styles like asking closed-ended questions. We want to teach them to ask open-ended questions. We want to teach communication partners to wait and see if somebody will respond or respond to all of their communication attempts. We want to teach modeling or aided language simulation, which we'll talk about in a second. How can we teach that? We can provide a verbal description and examples. If I want to talk about helping a DSP ask more open-ended questions, I need to provide, I need to give them examples of open-ended questions and what that means and what that looks like. I need to give them structured practice opportunities like, okay, here's a question. Was that open or closed? What do you think? And then opportunities to practice with the AAC user themselves. So you'll notice that in this strategies column, a lot of these things are mimicking the David McNaughton and Jennifer Kent Walsh 8 beautiful gold standard model stages of communication partner instruction. But this is just a little bit more realistic, a little bit more feasible for our teams. You'll also notice that these are multimodal. We want to provide all of these skills in multiple different modalities. I want to help people see it verbally. I want to help them practice, do video recordings. Let's look at pictures, right? How can we give them the full picture through a multiple different modalities? That's how humans learn. That's how a lot of us learn. So that's important to think about, teaching in multiple different formats. So Kent Walsh and McNaughton touched a little bit on aided language stimulation in their article, and they said that this was a super effective strategy to help our adults with ID or DD using AAC, specifically to facilitate choice making. So this is a really great skill if you're looking for like one interaction skill to help teach DSPs or residential staff or any communication partners. Consider aided language stimulation. And this really just involves providing input to the AAC user using their own AAC. So modeling, pointing, drawing attention to a message or symbol on their device or system while you're talking. If somebody has a low-tech communication board, you're pointing to the icons of their options for breakfast, so to say, while you're talking with them. They're looking at it too. You're sharing a gaze at the AAC device together. This can be really helpful to help people make choices. But again, this cannot be taught to communication partners until they have those baseline operational skills, until they have those positioning and access method skills. And then the fourth recommended skill to teach was using AAC across a variety of environments. So we've gotten our interaction skills down. How do we use it? Where do we use it? And in this, there's the dog. I don't know if you can hear him. This is really an opportunity for whole group discussion, right? The whole team comes together, folks from vocational settings, recreational settings. Let's all come together and identify a couple opportunities where we can help Tommy use his communication device, his low-tech board, his signs to communicate out in the community. We can start with choice making or requesting in those daily routines. And I suggest really putting this in the ISP, right? Creating specific guidelines for teams to follow. Really brainstorming, creating that whole team approach. We'll talk about involving DSPs in a few slides, but making sure that everybody is part of this conversation on how we can use this across environments. So recent estimates, 2024, 30 to 50% of AAC users abandon or underuse their device. Really high numbers, really high numbers. The poor device fit and features was identified as the major barrier, right? So feeling like the device is not a good fit for the individual. But I'd also like you to consider the team involvement in that. I'd like you to consider that teams can have a say in helping the device be a better fit. If somebody got it from school and it needs a makeover, then let's do that and make sure that we can try and reduce abandonment by making it a better fit if possible. And if a team is just considering AAC for the first time, making sure that all team members are part of that discussion, again, because the device has to be a good fit for our individuals with IDDD and their teams to support and implement in their natural environments. Okay, we're coming out of the weeds now. Is everybody okay? We're coming out of the weeds. We're coming into some real practical communication partner training. Let's take from the research. Let's apply it. How do we start? The first thing we have to do is establish buy-in from the team. Communication is a human right. We need to have staff buy into this concept that their adults that they're working with intellectual or developmental disability can communicate and have the right to be able to communicate. We have to explain to staff and communication partners how communication can be integrated into their current role with the individual, right? So we're not creating more work. Let's talk about how we can help you communicate with this individual in the way that you already work with them, in the capacity that you already do. And then we need to create outcomes and intervention targets. Once they've been taught the strategies, once they're familiar and comfortable, let's get something in writing. Let's find a place to start. So Danker and his colleagues identified 4 strategies that were successful for teaching communication partners all of the things that we just talked about, teaching them the operational skills, the access skills, the interaction. How do we teach people? There are 4 ways that we can be successful in this. It needs to be flexible. We need to teach them in a way that is uncomplicated, and easy to implement. And then we need to deliver it in multiple formats. So again, this comes back to that multi-modality instruction, providing written and verbal descriptions of the implementation tips and tools we want them to use, providing video demonstrations, giving the opportunity to do role play if appropriate with other professionals, practice opportunities, multiple different modalities to teach the strategies for communication partners. So the good news is that in our imperfect world, communication partner training can still be practical and still be feasible, even with the high workload, even with the limited time and resources that so many teams struggle with. Vandermeer looked at a ton of studies and identified groups that did training from 6 hours a day to 10 minutes a day. And there's no optimal duration or amount of time to teach communication partners that's like going to generalize and check off that skill for everybody over time. You can teach groups or individual staff. Again, there's no right answer, but the only feedback that really came from this study is that we need to provide that multi-component training package, multiple different modalities. I'm getting on my soapbox, I'll say it again. In-service presentations, instruction, role play, practice, feedback. That's what's been proven to be successful. And if that occurs in 10-minute increments over 2 weeks, great. If it occurs in 1 half-day training a month, great. Just know that having the opportunity to practice in multiple modalities is going to increase generalization for staff and be more successful for our adults who are using AAC. So consider adding communication partner training into the ISP, creating clear outcomes. I always kind of recommend identifying a point person to train new staff or answer questions that come in. Ideally, we're working with a speech language pathologist, and we'll talk about some of those opportunities in the next couple of slides. But it's helpful to have a staff person on the team who can answer any questions or knows where some of that relevant information is, especially about like operational skills that might need to come up with the device. You might focus your trainings on developing communication plans or even just increasing positive communication interactions. How can we give Tommy more opportunities to communicate in his daily routine, in his vocational setting? Let's train staff on that and make sure we're including outcomes related to that in the ISP. This is a really important slide. It's really boring to look at, but it's really important. Because the research is showing us that support staff is more likely to train others to use the device and use it themselves if they themselves view the equipment positively and understand the advantages of AAC. So that ties back to our overarching theme of attitude barriers. If somebody understands the device and they think it's valuable, they're more likely to be like, oh, well, let me help you program Tommy's device. And they're more likely to use it themselves. And then we also talk about that consulting with DSPs for implementation leads to increased commitment to intervention. That brings us back to the whole team approach of DSPs are part of the conversation. They are a crucial member of the team, and consulting with them leads to folks feeling more connected to the overarching goal, which is to help our adults with IDDD communicate using AAC. So we talked a little bit about recording device information. I kind of generally recommend keeping it all in one place, a binder or a Google Doc or whatever works for your team, especially if somebody is using a high-tech communication system like a Tobii Dynavox or something really kind of complicated and robust. Let's make sure we have information about the warranty, when it was last updated, how we can create a backup file, all that kind of stuff, as well as the responsibilities of the support people and caregivers on the team. Again, making sure that people don't have unclear roles and responsibilities. They understand what their job is on this team to facilitate communication for our adults. So practical ideas. We've talked about communication partner training. It's great. What do we do now? How do we start? We'll talk about AAC essentials in a little bit. If possible, maybe the team looks into a formal training through the app software or the company. LAMP is an example of an app that does a lot of trainings that you can attend. You can attend a PEX training, or if you have a device representative out in the world, you can contact your device representative for a formal training. Again, that might be more focused on the operational and positional skills versus the actual implementation, but it still could be a really good place to start to get teams on board. We'll talk about Just So in a few minutes. We talked about creating a communication binder. And then the last point on this slide that I want to touch on is connecting with your local SLP clinics. Universities around the state of Pennsylvania specifically offer insurance-funded or pro bono speech therapy services through their clinics. These are graduate students that are heavily supervised, very smart and bright, training to be speech-language pathologists that want and need and are eager for hands-on experience with this population. This is a really great opportunity to help cultivate and create goals from a team-based approach, with supporting the team, connecting with the clinic to kind of come up with goals together. Like, hey, Tommy just got this device. We don't really know how it works. Can we work with you to go through some training, and can you show us how to use it? And it's a really good way to access SLP services that we know can be really, really hard to come by. So I highly recommend your local speech language pathology clinic at universities, wherever you are, hopefully in Pennsylvania, but anywhere. AAC Essentials is a free online asynchronous course that, in my opinion, is designed explicitly to provide an answer for that barrier of attitude or understanding about AAC. These courses are designed to increase understanding of the basic concepts of AAC. And it addresses like how to interact with AAC users, how to use low-tech devices, how to support communication in transitions or community living arrangements. 4 course offerings depending on your role, but you can sign up for one or all of them and get access to any or all of the lessons within this course. Completely free, really great place to start if you're looking for information just on basic AAC, basic communication. How do people communicate? Why isn't this person talking? I don't understand. Let's kind of dive into it here in AAC Essentials. There's our website down there. You can find it and register completely free. You do get a certificate at the completion of the course. And Just So Speech Services is funded by the Office of Developmental Programs here in the state of Pennsylvania. These are short-term online consultative and collaborative SLP services for ODP consumers and their teams. This is exclusively for ODP consumers in the state of Pennsylvania. The services are completely virtual, and folks and their teams can receive up to 15 hours of support. Myself and my colleague Jen Lisberger, who is on here as well, run this program, and it has been so successful in helping teams understand and get trained on whatever AAC device or system their individual is using. We can also help select or trial different equipment if you're interested or in trying something new. We can provide funding reports and do the whole insurance process. And just access AAC services. We're hoping to take the barrier of access to AAC professionals and hopefully remove it by making these services free and virtual for folks within the state of Pennsylvania. If you're interested in more information and the referral form, the website link is down there too. We do have a bit of a wait list, so if you have somebody, please fill out the referral form. We'd love to meet with you and your team. Some additional ideas from the research. The first one is video sampling. So communication partners were able to watch and identify missed communication opportunities when they watched a video of themselves and the individual with intellectual disabilities interacting together. So this could really help with, again, breaking down some of the barriers of not understanding their own communication style. How can we be more responsive? Where are those missed communication opportunities? This has been proven to be successful in the research, as well as self-assessments, identifying a communication partner's own perceptions or concerns about communication, feeling like I don't understand, where's my limitations inherently of understanding communication as a whole, much less understanding somebody who might not be communicating verbally, right? So helping them to identify and work through some of that themselves could be another idea to help you facilitate successful training. So what is our final takeaway? We talked about a lot. Direct support professionals, residential staff, all communication partners, family, friends, healthcare professionals are often the primary communication partners for our adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities. They have the opportunity to have a huge impact on how folks are using AAC, when folks are using AAC, and helping them to be successful as part of this shared communication partnership, facilitating the two-way street. We're all communicating together. They are really like the crux of communication. So we can help teams identify their own intrinsic barriers and develop focused and structured training plans to address those barriers, knowing that communication partners are an integral part of the conversation. They need proper training and they need to be involved in communication goal setting and development, and part of the larger conversation on helping people with complex communication needs communicate in vocational, recreational, and community settings. These are the references for this presentation. Super interesting articles if you're like interested in getting more into the weeds. They're there for you. Follow us on social media. We have a large social media presence on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, but that's what they say. We're doing quite well over there. Apparently, I have no idea. And this is our contact information. I also linked the AAC community website. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, all of our webinar series throughout the month of October have been recorded and will be posted on aacommunity.net for your future reference or referral. You also can find more information about Just So on AAC Community, as well as AAC Essentials. We are housed within the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University in the College of Education and Human Development. And this is our certificate request form and survey. I see that there are a couple chats. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer them now while we're completing surveys. No, nothing.
No questions in the chat, Cassie. Just the PDF of the slide deck.
Awesome. If you have any questions, feel free, ask away. If you're interested in a certificate, please just give us a little bit of time to create it for you. We need to verify that you've attended the whole webinar, and just make sure to indicate on the survey that you are interested in a certificate. Any questions,
You
thoughts?
have a question in the Q&A. This is amazing. Thank you. Do you know if any services like this exist in Virginia?
Don't know if any services like this exist in Virginia. I hope so. I really do. I unfortunately am so limited to my knowledge with Pennsylvania. I recommend reaching out to your AT Act program. If you look up AT Act program Virginia, you'll find your AT Act program. I can't guarantee that they have a service like this, but they might have a connection to somebody or some program who does. TechOWL is the AT Act program for the state of Pennsylvania, so that's why I provide that referral. So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful. Um, Here's our contact information. If you want to email any of us about questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for attending the webinar today, as well as the entire webinar series throughout this month of October. It's been so special to share this information with you and share our love for AAC and AAC topics. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all for attending this afternoon. Thank you, everybody.